Welcome. This is the February 5th, 2025 OpenZFS production user call. We have Eva, Andrew, Stu, Philip, Jan, Dan, Stephen, Greg, Alexander, and myself, Michael. And let's see, Philip brought up a tantalizing paper on yesterday's informal jail and zones call. I will bring that up. And Philip, what did you find? What stood out for you?
Well, basically, someone had just randomly linked to this on, some of the activity pub threads, and I thought, oh, this is pretty neat. And looking at the uh, source, it's not a peer-reviewed, but it turns out that it's a master's project for an operating system student who just finished it a year ago, and they did it on Linux, comparing multiple file systems with a billion files, very small files between 1 and 10K. And I thought, okay, this is pretty neat. But what I noticed in this was that ZFS had notably worse performance than all the other ones. But also, what stood out was that it was not optimized for small files. So it had 128K record size. And I thought, well, that's not really fair in comparison. So, what could be done to better look at ZFS performance if it were basically optimized when you already know that the size of your files are going to be between 1 and 10K, just like you would for database files, for example, like Postgres. And so I also emailed the person, and they replied back with a GitHub repository that has the C source code
Link,
that they
link,
used.
link.
It's in the
Oh, it's in
document.
there. Excellent.
Yeah, I added it
Good
just a
one.
little because they just emailed a couple of hours ago.
Excellent.
Uh, and so I included that. And so what I thought would be worthwhile, because I've worked with some projects that work with a lot of small files, not a billion files, but uh, when you have a lot of small known files, I thought, okay, well, what could we do to, have optimization? And I know ZFS optimization, is always a big deal when you start talking about big numbers. Uh, but since this was on Linux, and we already know that it's not necessarily going to be kernel optimized, it's going to be user space optimized. What could be done on, say, Illumos or FreeBSD, and rerun this same sort of a test? They gave, I think, enough system specs for comparison. So it's uh, they also sent more details with a 32 core HP 840 workstation, 256 gigs of RAM, a 2 terabyte solid state drive for the code and logs, and then a 14 gigabyte uh, standard drive for the generated files. And they're only using about 6 terabytes worth of data. So that's, able to be reproduced on pretty much any typical hardware without a whole lot of effort. Uh, so that's what I was wondering, what we could look at for replicating this sort of uh, a scenario of saying, how do you tune ZFS when you have a billion small files? Uh, and I think something like changing the record size would be an obvious one, but I didn't know what other things I would do to be able to recreate this. Now, I don't have an exact system that's a match, but my dev system has 128 gigs of RAM and some. It doesn't seem to be CPU based or CPU throttled.
Hmm.
But what other things would we monitor on ZFS? Because there's no mention of things like ARC uh, to see, are we, are we actually testing the driver? Are we testing how many times it's duplicate writing, or but because I don't know Linux uh, ZFS use to know if it's even measuring the actual performance, or if it's measuring a number that is somehow masking the performance or duplicating things or whatever. So what would we be able to measure uh, to accurately reflect ZFS performance on, say, Illumos and uh, FreeBSD, and then see how those measurements on in this case, it's an Ubuntu 22.04 system. Could those metrics also be replicated on the Ubuntu-based system as an example?
Okay. Uh, right off the bat, is a 1K file a pretty tangible workload that people have seen and we can categorize in some way?
It
You mentioned
Sure,
databases.
small files exist. but a same database wouldn't put each kilobyte in its own file. Common, I think Postgres is among the smallest database block sizes with 8K. MySQL by default uses 16K, and then other more modern database designs have even bigger blocks.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with 1K is that on modern both spinning disks and solid state drives, the A shift, so the logarithm of the smallest allocation at the base 2, is normally so that it's set to 12, which means your smallest allocation is 4 kilobytes. We don't have some kind of sub-block allocation, which
Okay.
for good reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But my very first question is, are these pathological or totally unrealistic micro benchmarks which will be tripped up by ZFS's cache management so that some micro benchmarks look totally ridiculously either fast or slow because just the behavior of a copy on write file system and so on?
Mm-hmm.
If you force ZFS to do stupid write amplifications, which you can if you flush it a lot, then you can create a massive amount of metadata overhead per write if you do a single thread of small metadata changes and you flush and don't have an S-log device and so on. And sure, you can make ZFS look bad. These are normally not very realistic benchmarks for larger workloads because they don't give you these benchmarks, that is, enough concurrency so that you can aggregate multiple threads of stupid operations so that you still can saturate sequential writes of your log devices. And the other problem is that, yeah, often they're just not realistic, but that can also make ZFS look incredible if your micro benchmarks fails in the other direction because you're effectively measuring ZFS's caching behavior instead of the disks.
Yeah,
Benchmark
you're
your
And
RAM. Okay.
yeah, you're benchmarking RAM.
benchmarking, especially compressed RAM. So, oh, my working set is 4 times as large as my RAM. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
before compression, but you're
Right.
testing with zeros. So even just zero length encoding gives you basically free infinite compression or close enough to it that you suddenly think that ZFS is faster than your DRAM controller, which it
Yeah. Okay.
obviously can't be.
So
Yeah.
I'd be curious why they reinvented this wheel, segueing from a FIO discussion. Like why couldn't FIO provide a workload of that nature? But maybe they have
I'm
an excellent
also
reason and maybe it's brilliant. Go ahead.
the thought that popped into my head immediately was it's not just going to be about the size of the files being 1K. Um, like Jan points out, the sector size of modern disks are going to be 4K. So our minimum allocation is going to be 4K.
Yes, on ZFS, but other file systems have sub-block allocators. For example,
Yes,
traditional UFS calls them fragments, and
and there are pros and cons to that.
yes, but
But
for a 1 kilobyte file, sure, you would want something like that, but only if you don't update them
even
frequently because
still, what
that's
I'm getting at is that above and beyond just the file size question that we have here, it's also very important to discuss how they're accessing it. I mean, if they're reading very sequentially stuff, even not considering that kind of the sequential access pattern, ZFS is going to kick ass on. On the other hand, if we have a very random pattern that specifically does not have hotspots, so it's like cryptographically random, ZFS is going to do awesome. Is going to do awful because you can't predict that.
And
So
I think this is, very much an artificial workload because it's basically write everything in sequence one at a time, read everything in sequence one at a time, and spit out the number. So it's not realistic of a balanced workload of any sort. Uh, I was just wondering what might be done, that would be more realistic of a workload. Well, maybe not even more work of a workload because there's a lot better workload models. Uh, but what would make ZFS look like it's really poor in performance compared to other ones, or is it just simply the fact that it's not natively supported, perhaps on the OS that it was tested on? Like in the kernel testing.
I mean, I don't specifically know that much about Linux's ZFS implementation, but I know in general, what I would be, what I would be looking at is I would be looking at how Arc is getting used. So
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you from the defaults of Ubuntu 22.04, the base setup of its performance sucks for ZFS. It needs to be tweaked. It needs to be adjusted. It's one of those that, I mean, from the README that Michael is spinning through, it's taking all defaults. There's no tuning at all. That version that is on for 22.04 does not have compression by default. It doesn't have A time off. Those things are going to be very impactful. I mean, A time alone is probably enough to pop it up 20%.
Oh, yeah.
And I know personally, I disable A time all the time.
Oh, I do too. I mean, it's part of my default install script.
Yep, it is for me as well.
Yeah, so POSIX controls and SA or X attributes and A time off and compression off for my scenario.
But
my normal use case is compression off. So yeah, those are things that were not done and basically shot ZFS in the foot out of the gate.
But from the workload you're describing, I cannot see how anything could reasonably get into either the most frequently used or most recently used caches.
Oh, right.
I see that very easily.
It's just not going to
happening
use the
if you
caching.
rerun the same benchmark multiple times to warm up, and then you're measuring the arc.
Even if you do that though, each time through, it's probably going to end up tossing out that most frequently used because each time through you're getting one read of the entire set of files. I mean, I don't know how we're ever going to look good at that cache. Huh?
How large is that set of files after compression?
I didn't hear that said, but
without compression, it was about 6 terabytes. So that was the raw amount in the billion files because they're only 4K. So the total amount
what's in the files?
I think I haven't looked at the code, but I think that it's random data with, for whatever reason, a CRC32 at the last 8 bytes of the file is how it was described. I haven't looked at the actual C code, but that's what it said in the paper.
And I will always wonder if you solve the heck out of a problem that we don't have, but go ahead.
No, I mean, I personally, I think it's a very interesting thing.
Yeah.
If everybody that is knowledgeable comes to the table and says, "Hey, this is how to tune BtrFS. Here's how to tune."
Sure. Exactly.
This group ZFS, and do it right. Versus, hey, take the defaults and wonder why my process isn't running the way it should.
I mean, I know this is probably one of those troublesome answers, but from the test as described, this is not a realistic enough test to ever look good on ZFS. Does that make sense?
I agree wholeheartedly. Yeah.
Well, what I was thinking
random file sizes, sequences, out of sequences, all that kind of stuff. What's real life, which goes back to what we talked about at the summit and ad nauseum before, during, and after of
I mean,
what does my workload look like versus what Andrew's looks like versus what Michael's looks like.
even if you take, an array that's got nothing but a bunch of 1K files as somewhat realistic, your workload on that kind of a file system is very unlikely to be pure sequential. And it's very unlikely to be completely random for the data set either. Usually for those kind of files, I mostly actually expect small text files for that kind of data set, although not exclusively.
Yeah,
But I would still expect hotspots on usage.
Yeah, I mean, look at what happens if you open up a share on Explorer. Hey, I just go and inventory that whole file directory and get samples of the first three. That type of scenario creates a hotspot based upon, hey, number one is always the first one that picks up. That's a realistic use case from an end user view versus an artificial use case from a server view.
Noted. And if you're only sampling the first 3 files and they're all 1K, that'll be mighty quick. Anyway.
Especially the second time you do it.
Yeah.
For
Yes,
this kind
Jan.
of use case, one of the interesting things, if you have some control over the application, you can do is just stuff it in an SQLite database and see what happens. Just use SQLite blobs because that may vastly reduce the system call overhead by just putting it all in a file and allowing it to be cached better. And the metadata is now also part of the same file, or even multiple SQLite databases because they're so lightweight. Sometimes it's faster than just native files for this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I'd argue, gee, are they using the completely wrong tool for this? So anyway,
well, of course, there
such
are
is life.
other object store API
One at a
libraries which
time.
are
One at a time.
optimized for this use case. For example, something like LMDB's memory mapped interface may be even better, despite mmap not being ZFS's strong suit.
Go ahead, Stu.
I'm good.
Okay. Well, let's say take a peek at that paper if you're interested. It's in the doc, and I hope he does great on that PhD. And let's move on. As a simple repo. So in researching the little benchmarks, perhaps Olympics, that I was discussing about with Eva, well, there's a simple repo here. You may have seen it flash by, which was like, gee, here is an SMB workload. Here is a database workload. And it may be a terrible one, but at least the message was super clearly communicated, which is a great start. Steve, you have a sync question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Yes, sir.
So we're there's a team that's bringing a large customer from an on-prem Windows install to the cloud onto ZFS, but the source is not on ZFS, and so because it's on Windows, I really struggled with them to find an rsync implementation that kind of worked on both ends. I think we've got that squared away, and they're slowly building up the sync for the cutover, which is in a few weeks. And I'm a little uncomfortable just assuming that we've got the files correct, and so I'm interested in any recommendations for, hey, you could spot check on each side using such and such.
Others
So
go ahead. I've got some things up to
yeah, I mean,
see from years ago. Yeah,
yeah, I
do.
mean, our sync do a lot with that exact same type of thing, moving data around. Our clone, same thing. They do the checksums on the fly, and if you do it in the don't execute, just report standpoint, it's much quieter. But no, I mean, at some point, you have to trust the tools that are doing it until they're proven not to be worthwhile.
I mean, checksum's going to be your answer there. And like you said, rsync does checksumming on its own, so or can with the proper flags.
I would, if this was a Linux install, and so on the Windows side, I forget what they're using now. We tried a few different things. These Windows installations are actually old, so we had limited options.
Mm-hmm.
So we were using Sigwin, and that may be where we landed. So I trust rsync.
Yeah, go ahead. I was going to say the Sigwin version of rsync is the Linux version. I mean, it's the same. It's the same thing. So all the same flags that would apply to a Linux version should still apply to Sigwin, and it should be equally usable.
Yeah, I've had good luck with Sigwin as well in those type of environments, Steve. But yeah, I mean, when it comes down to, I mean, you know that, if you get a rough value of, hey, here are the number of bits that Windows thinks this folder is and what it is on Linux, and it's close, and your rsync checksums or dry runs match, that's pretty good. Short of going and writing your own script to do a source and destination checksum on it.
Which admittedly, in like PowerShell is not that hard to do, but do you want to waste the time to do it?
You said it was ancient, so PowerShell's probably not on it.
That's fair.
I think also they do have PowerShell.
Oh, okay.
I don't know what version it is. I thought briefly about maybe something like you're saying, like a checksum to just even just to spot check a few files would probably be sufficient. Yeah.
It's certainly something to do, or that you could do if you really wanted to. I don't remember the specifics of the commands. PowerShell's got commands to generate MD5 or SHA-256 checksums.
That's built in. I don't have to do
Yeah.
any. Oh, well,
Yeah,
that
the
might be
MD5 is definitely in there.
okay. I think
But
that
again, it's one of those that, yeah, you can do it. Is it worth the effort? It depends on what you're getting paid to do.
so I'll just be sort of recommending. I'm trying to stay out of this particular project.
Got it.
So I may recommend, hey, spot check these critical files.
Yeah, or do a random spot check of anything over, whatever. I mean, again, don't know what the file sizes are, but anything over a 10 gig file, spot check it.
Right.
Just because that's where you're going to have a network hiccup, might introduce something that didn't get caught.
Okay.
But again, that's without knowing what your network looks like, your speeds, and all that kind of stuff. So just pick a random number and say, hey, anything over 25 gig, that gets eyeball checked. Anything 10 to 25 gets programmatically checked. Everything else, we're going to trust rsync. If that's how the value of their data actually maps. Usually it is, but sometimes, hey, a 1K file might be the most important thing because that's got my keys in it.
Right. We probably on this one have a specific 2 or 3 directories that are super critical, and everything else is.
So in that scenario, I would zip it without compression, transfer it, unzip it, and then do a comparison on the other side. That'll give you a really good baseline.
Or at least just compare that one directory programmatically.
Yeah.
Oh,
And if
that's
it's
actually that sounds easy. I could say do a sync, get current, and now do a zip, bring that over, and now I'm on Linux. I can rsync, and I trust rsync on that machine
Yeah.
to get it right.
Yeah. I mean, I've used tar as the transmission mechanism too. Tar through SSH. If
I've
you
done
got
that
a
so many
stable
times.
yeah, if you got a stable network, it works great. But again, lots of variables in there. Lots
I
of different
think the
places.
tar over SSH was one of the first things I did to copy a disk to another disk, like decades ago.
Before you got to
Yeah,
DB.
it's still reliable.
Yep. There's a reason stuff works in Linux.
Yep.
And BSD stuff just works because it's had centuries, it seems like, to make it functional.
Not centuries, but I think that one's been around since at least the 80s.
Yep.
Centuries of CPU time. How's that?
That I'll accept.
Boom.
joking aside, if it's small files and there are text files, version control systems like Git also do a good job, especially when you want to merge diverging systems, but they don't scale to large binary files.
Mhm.
At least not with further complications like Git Annex, which is a whole other tool to learn.
The only other thing I've noticed with trying to move things from Windows environments to ZFS environments is one of the places that ZFS can get a little painful with is path length when you're coming off of a Windows environment. Windows can have a much longer path.
Don't you have to explicitly opt into that? Isn't Windows by default restricted to 253 plus device? Because I've had customers run into that, they can't unpack some crazy zip archive with 200 plus character long directories containing another 200 plus file name because people forgot what hierarchical file systems are. And just repeat all the information so that you
it's not the specific,
I don't think it was path length.
I don't think it was a specific file name length. I think it was the full path name length. So
yeah, that's normally lower than 1024 on Windows, but you can use long path support. Yes.
I've seen it come up, particularly if you've got stuff using multi-byte characters.
Yeah.
Or GUIDs. Yeah. Or UUIDs. So yeah, I've seen that too.
This has bitten me in the posterior on older FreeBSD releases when mount paths have, especially snapshot names, could easily get too long to mount through the normal mount system call, because it was limited to something like 88 characters or something. Which is easily exceedable if you have a long virtual machine name and then 2 levels of nesting and then a snapshot with a long time date stamp and maybe a lifetime, and then you're above the length limit for the device name.
I've been throwing in notes based on the last time I bumped into this, and these are great points. And if you have a big old tar archive or zip archive at both ends, you can check some of that, at least for one little layer of safety. The one thing I'm not finding is some rsync server for Windows, like the actual rsync daemon, and it had a god-awful name like Cyber Sync or RoboSync or something, but
Robocopy isn't exactly rsync.
Oh, it is
But
not. And also I made a note that Robocopy, just thank you for the reminder, just get it out there. It does not preserve date stamps by default, and there are
but
flags that will allow that. I can drop them in if you like. Go ahead, Jan.
the normal async executable should have a server built in unless they remove that in Sequin. You just have to invoke it with the right arguments.
Right. Yeah, this was one separate little project with a 1990s looking website, but it works. It was just something sync. Anyway,
I find things with 1990s looking websites almost always work flawlessly.
Sigwin. So yeah, I know it's crazy.
Yeah, putty.
Putty, but exactly. It was that kind of that feel
When did
exactly.
they remove the 64-bit alpha support from the
Ah,
latest release? They carried that around for ages.
oh, no kidding. Well, it
Like
works.
a few years ago, they still had Windows NT in 2000 on alpha in their latest releases. It was made me chuckle.
Hmm. Cool. Steve, I hope that helps too. In the real world, this is absolutely the kind of things people bump into, and having something sync all night and then not have, well, not have the original date stamp, have today's date stamp is really not helpful. And bookkeepers, etc., hate that. Don't ask me how I know. And yeah, you got to work around it. But interesting point that if, like the previous example, maybe looking at a database, if you were to just check in that repo to Git and then check it out elsewhere, you may get a whole bunch of checksumming along the ride and preservation that may not exist elsewhere. So, anything else on this topic? Great topic. I can't find that one with the silly name, but it was Robo or Cyber or something, but it worked.
Oh, do yourself a favor and put your old legacy config files in version control.
Cool.
If you have these old systems where you don't really know what happens, put them in
Sure.
Git, all the configs, even the little binary files, and then just update, and then at least you have a little commit message, even if it's not all that great, telling you, hey, at this point in time, I changed it, and this was my intention, even if you didn't get it right.
I have started becoming very liberal with the Git init in a lot of directories now. It's just a little bit of version control in a directory somewhere goes a long way.
As a reminder, Git does not mean GitHub or any of these other remote services, because
Yeah.
if you're putting configs in, you would have to be careful about releasing data that should not be released. Particularly now that everybody seems to want to run their AI bots over other people's data.
Good point.
Beat me to it, Andrew. Great minds like my friend.
You beat him to it on that point. And you've probably seen people throw their private SSH keys in GitHub as part of their project. Like, yeah, you probably don't want to do
GitHub
that.
upgraded their global search, and they had to disable it for 2 weeks or so to give people time to hide their sins. That was so funny.
Nice.
Almost as funny as when Google came up with Google Code Search as a lab project, basically allowing you to match regexes close together and source code against everything indexed. And you could just express likely bad code smells as a few regexes which have to match close together in the same source file, and then get, okay, next 0 day, next 0 day.
Jeez. Oh, good point. If you find a vulnerability, if they make it help to search everyone who's got the same one, that's a mildly terrifying notion. Charming. Other topics or questions before Jan jumps into some news on his libzfs discovery that I find somewhat tantalizing. Okay. Jan did some science, I'm guessing, over the weekend or last week, and then reported Tuesday that Maybe things need not be so painful with libzfs core. Jan, let her rip. I'll keep looking for that poorly named Windows thing. Computer.
The thing is, in theory, we as users have access to libzfs core, which is supposed to be the API and ABI compatible library to interface with most of ZFS from C or any language which has foreign function support. Okay, the problem now is that at least on FreeBSD and as far as I know on common Linux distros as well, you cannot build against libzfs core because it again pulls in headers which aren't even installed as a build dependency. So if you get the resulting command, you can easily run it with libzfs core and take advantage. But in FreeBSD, that means you have to have the kernel sources checked out and have to pull in the headers and set up a compiler header include fart to mangle all your system headers in a way which really trips up more safe and defensive compiler flags, because it really abuses what you can do with GCC extensions to make it look like to ZFS libraries like were built under Solaris. In the user space parts. So, for example, struct UUID changes the field names despite maintaining the same memory layout. And that's very annoying, in my opinion, that we have this library, but we can't build against it. So now the problem is, in theory, the CDDL is similar to GPL as in that it is a copyleft license, but it's a weaker copyleft license, which means you can just pull in a header, not modify it, and still ship your resulting executable and your source code under a more permissive license like BSD or MIT. It's not viral across file boundaries, unlike GPL, which is where some of the GPL incompatibility comes in. So I looked around what it really needs and found that it needs about 4 type defs and 2 headers, which do not have to be modified. So I can just copy them into a project, and they do not infect the whole project with CDDL licensing because they are unmodified headers. And those headers basically only define enums and a few open structs. And
Frankly,
because
sorry, go ahead.
And because libzfs core mostly deals with pointers to type-def structs, you don't even have to know in your code the internal layout. It just has to be compatible. I cannot guarantee that this fast and loose way of dealing with system headers from the point of view of ZFS doesn't have unintended consequences. I did some basic tests. It works. It didn't segfault. It didn't produce garbage. And ZFS is pretty good about validating it. And it also exchanges all the data in NV pairs. So it's type plain value encoded anyway. So there's not much chance that any corruption doesn't just break decoding. So yeah, there's a way to just pull in these 2 headers, define 4 type defs, and include the 1 header file, and then you can build against it, and the result can then be made available, for example, through the ports tree without having to configure your package builders on FreeBSD to have base system sources checked out in your build environment and so on, which, if I remember correctly, at least a while ago, it wasn't the default build configuration. So these kind of ports were not available as binary packages in the default repositories. And the first, as you can see there, commented out in the document, kind of below yeah, it's a lot of C flags to set normally, and you don't have to. Just one include directory with 2 headers, the 2 I mentioned there, is enough. Tools in base get around without that. And while all of this is useful for my crazy FreeBSD jail shenanigans, it could also be the way for Samba to have proper shadow copy support available on operating systems which don't bundle their modified Samba code like TrueNAS does.
Yep,
So that we can just have the Samba port install an optional shadow copy Samba virtual file system module, which will then make ZFS snapshots show up to Windows clients as shadow copies.
On that very topic, Jan, did you mention that maybe we're doing it wrong and that in theory, Samba could use a channel program to list and manage be it previous snapshots, etc., for use in shadow copies?
You have to do certain things through channel programs if you want to use only libzfs core.
I see.
Because the iterator functions through dedicated octals are not exposed because you can do it with a channel program, I assume. So the libzfs iter function families to iterate over the data sets children and so on, those are only in libzfs core, but the equivalent functionality exists for channel programs, and it looks like the only way to run a channel program is through libzfs core. There is no help for running them built into the base libzfs because that functionality came late.
Okay, but would it skirt around the need for a synchronized set of headers built in? In the case of Samba alone, it doesn't help you with your, what I recall was a tool to yet faster deploy jails, which motivated
it
this.
means that with this hack, you can, at least it looks like it, you can build against libzfs without having the whole OpenZFS
Yeah,
sources
totally. Cool.
around. And because of details in the CDDL license, as far as I, as a non-lawyer, can tell, it does not infect your executables or your source repository across file boundaries like GPL would, where, oh, this is now one piece of work and everything is derived and contaminated and becomes viral. No, you can do it on a per file boundary, and because you don't even have to modify the files, everything is fine, and you can just redistribute the files unmodified without any massive obligations.
And talk to your lawyer.
Exactly. Talk to your copyright lawyer, legal counsel, whatever.
Yeah. Andrew, what was the term used for not a stable API, but a decided from the summit? Something API.
Committed.
Committed. Thank you. Now, does this sound like we're addressing that issue? If anything, those headers were to be it versioned separately or something. What are the action items to say, hey, these are your friends, here is how you can use them, and we make certain guarantees to not rip out, to not become like mentally committed to the institution via a committed API.
That sounds very good to me. So
got it.
I love it.
And is it clear about his workaround of previously it was a whole bunch of stuff, and then, oh, maybe we can gently integrate that too.
What I was going to say about his licensing comment there a little bit, even if you had to do some stuff in those files, they would still be scoped just to those files, which is the nice thing about a CDDL, is it meshes well with most other licenses.
So your obligation is to share your modifications to those files only.
Yep.
Not you don't have to relicense effectively your whole repository under that copyleft license. It's not as viral and strongly copyleft as the GPL.
It's a non-viral copyleft.
Yep.
Is what I would say.
Yeah. You can
Or is
describe
it
it like
file
that.
level like MPL and CDDL? Is that accurate?
It's derived
Yes.
from MPL.
What was the other?
So you have the
MPL?
pattern grant language in there, which is the main GPL conflict. Because you have this forced pattern piece between
Yeah.
licensors and licensee.
They're not too thrilled on the whole scoping difference either, from what I've seen.
Yeah, but adding an obligation on top of what the GPL gives you is incompatible with both GPL 2 and 3. So you must not restrict the freedoms the GPL forces you to give your users. So, which may be good for users, but maybe annoying or even hostile to certain developers and their development model.
Speaking of
So,
which,
yeah.
do we know of any CDDL violations from the various storage vendors of the world? I know there have been a few proprietary product presentations at the summit over the years. Are they doing the right thing, doing the wrong thing? So, heard of any?
I'm not specifically aware of any, but it's not something I would go out of my way to look for either. I mean, really, the issue becomes, even if there is, who has the authority by copyright to prosecute them?
That is a further complicated question. I will acknowledge.
Because a whole lot of them is going. A whole lot of those kind of things are at this point going to be
potentially, it's not just the original author who's authorized to sue, depending on jurisdiction, but also the user who is denied access to modifications they want to have for software they have.
The jury's out on that, at least here in the States.
That's why I said it depends on jurisdiction.
It's going to depend on jurisdiction very much. I obviously only even have a passing familiarity with my own. I don't have an in-depth familiarity with anyone else's. So,
and I vaguely remember that CDDL 1, which at least part of ZFS I think is licensed under, may have problems with European copyright law that they don't mesh well, but that's, yeah, again, getting into the weeds.
Yeah, that nicely put. So yes, we're in the weeds, but they're all valid questions. If it's a baby step closer to a committed API, that is great to hear. That very much came up, and it's like that and JSON output. Why don't we just have simple? Oh, and is this a uniquely FreeBSD problem insofar as FreeBSD brought in OpenZFS? Everyone has it kind of bolted on, and when it's bolted on, you just point at the version in that, and maybe you're good. I mean, how are they handling shadow copies on, say, Linux and Samba and ZFS?
They don't. They don't. That's simple. And I think, yeah, we have the same problem in FreeBSD. The annoying thing is we don't have to have a problem. It would be pretty easy to just change the way we install what is there, because everything we need exists in our FreeBSD base repository, but it just doesn't get installed by the makefiles.
Interesting.
These headers exist.
Oh, so you need the sources to get them. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, you need the kernel sources to get the headers because they're not installed.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's just it's really a porting / packaging problem at that point. But we don't even have the header files to work with. It's also that now basically you have to pull in these two so that you can make use of the libzfs core header, which gets installed. But it includes headers which are not installed, so you can't use it normally.
Yeah.
But yeah, so why do we install a header if it includes things which aren't installed? It's obviously unusable in the current state without having the system sources around, at which point you're building against the headers which are part of the kernel sources and not against the one which are installed, I hope. Otherwise, it's even worse breakage in the build system.
Hmm.
Yeah, sorry for
No
that.
worries. No, you are shedding light on something that has obviously been underrepresented, or else we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Flummoxed a number of us.
There you go. And we don't want flummoxing. And in all practicality, if like Samba shadow copies, which are kind of a killer app feature when integrated with ZFS, are denied from users, well, let's find the shortest path to correcting that across the board on different OSs that happen to support Samba.
So that's why I brought up the licensing. The nice thing is,
Yeah, totally.
technically, the Samba could import those two headers into their repository. It wouldn't infect them, but there's some FUD around licensing, and because of that, I expect a painful discussion when you suggest to just pull into CDDL licensed headers
Hmm.
into this Samba VFS module.
Hmm.
Yeah, the other thing is that for some operations, maybe starting a channel program every time you want to enumerate the shadow copies may be more expensive than using the older, even less stable libzfs interface, because it uses specialized ioctets to enumerate that instead of the generic one to launch a channel program which then returns the result.
But
But if you want to filter the results, the channel program may still be faster because you can filter inside the kernel in the channel program to only return that which you really need, and not everything returned by the existing ioctl by default.
It's
which
probably,
go ahead, Austin.
as I say,
Points
it's
have been made.
probably worth noting that from the Solaris side of things, Samba wasn't really a consideration ever because they just did their own CIFS implementation in kernel. So
And
they don't
the
care,
other thing is,
or they didn't care.
if you unhide the .zfs directory, that may be the fastest and easiest way to enumerate the snapshots.
This is true.
Or you
That's
don't
fair.
even have to if someone knows that
Yeah.
by convention each share is a ZFS dataset and does not contain other sub-datasets, then it knows that it can just check the .zfs path if it exists, even if it's not listable. So it doesn't have to, or failing that, it could probe along the path, but that would put some load on the name cache. But yeah,
I'm curious, is there any notion of permissions on the .zfs directory such that, say, the daemon could only see it and then it's only exposed through Samba per user or some cleverness so that just you don't show everybody everything?
yeah, that could be a problem because you cannot change retroactively the permissions on snapshotted files.
Well,
So
permissions
once
within it, but what about just visual
The
being
directory itself.
the parent directory, which
what I
often
mean
has a
is,
lower one?
yeah, but the annoying part is that you cannot fix permission errors in snapshots, is what I
Sure.
mean.
Yeah, fair enough.
And users may be able to create a symlink into the .zfs directory, which would then be followed by the kernel. And so even if Samba tries to make a reasonable effort to not follow this kind of symlink, it will get tripped up and then not check that, oh, the .zfs directory doesn't exist. So I'm not following this path because
Yeah.
you just follow a symlink and don't do slow and error-prone workarounds to not follow symlinks. You will implicitly follow the symlink, and then you're in the .cfs directory, which on its own is not a security threat. But if you expect that
If you expect something's
snapshots to be
unreadable,
inaccessible, and you know that there used to be a permission error which still exists in your snapshots, then yeah, it can be a really annoying problem to solve, because in that case you kind of have to, yeah, do something unconventional, like create a clone and then promote the history over and delete it or something in the origin file system so that it's not accessible. I guess you could use the Samba, what's its name? There's some kind of VFS module where you can veto specific file names and maybe even paths. So if you use that, you may be able to veto anything named .cfs in a path and then kind of hide it that way. But that would also break the use case you want unless there's special support for that. So yeah, snapshots perfectly preserve the state as is. You do not get to rewrite history
Of course.
on snapshots.
And
It
the
is what it
purpose
is.
of shadow copies is to go back in time and see something. So I'm not worried about that.
and
Just
I
trying to
know,
think how to correctly do this, a workaround that doesn't rely on a header.
I mean, I know on our side of things, our implementation, it just treats the snapshots as a shadow copy to a Windows machine. So
So you do
it
see
will show.
them?
Oh yeah, we see them.
Okay.
Yep. With the Solaris built-in SMB server.
Yeah, but yeah, with
Just
the kernel
share
snips.
sys.
Yep.
But we don't have that on
Yeah.
FreeBSD or Linux.
The problem is, we've got that whole thing because we don't have an interface problem at all with it.
It's your ZFS.
Exactly.
You break it, you bought it. Got it. And gee, I just out of, I don't know, just a sick inquiry. I suppose there's no Samba on Sigwin, but I assume someone out there has tried to build Samba on Windows just because. But what do I know? Anyway, other thoughts, questions, ideas, twisted searches like that. It's your
So
call,
one
not
workaround
mine.
I'm
Yes, sir.
using right now
Yes,
is
sir.
to have either a symlink or an alias file for Mac clients to just have an alias named snapshots and taught my users to double click that snapshot if they want to view the directory containing all the snapshots. And that works. So unhide the ZFS directory so that it's only a normally hidden file and not a lie about it when listing. So then macOS clients can follow it, or even symlinks would work out of the box. And you don't get any special support for switching between different versions, but at least you can see them easily enough, and users can be trained to know if I need that file. I go to the top level of the share, click on snapshots, and then get the listing. Yeah, you don't get that listing Andrew just shared from a Windows client.
Okay, so same question. Does every user have appropriate permissions? And they, if it's if it's share wide, they only see their files. I hope that's enforced. I trust that's enforced.
Well, it
the
gets
way
enforced to the degree you enforced it at the time you created the snapshot.
Right, so it's that's carried forward. It's not like they're stripped in any way, just saying.
in
Yes, Andrew.
in this specific case, we're talking about each user is the only person who's got access to that particular file system anyway. So it's a non, you know, it's not an issue.
Is your image sensitive in any way, or can I post it in?
Oh, that image is not sensitive at all. I mean, it's
Right.
just I take snapshots. This is not a secret. I make this quite public.
Okay. Let's see if our friends at Zoom will let me just do copy paste. And yes, it did it. Wow, weird. So yeah, home by schedule. And
Yeah,
so if there's any risk that someone's not following us on what we mean by shadow copies, that's the Windows GUI integration in Explorer to see files in previous dates of time. And naturally, if that's linked to a ZFS snapshot, you get a whole bunch of benefits.
Is that some? I remember something called VSS. Is that similar?
volume shadow.
VSS is what does it if you're just straight up in Windows. The way the CIFS interface works is it treats it presents across CIFS that I have VSS copies, even though VSS was not used to create them. So it kind of it's faking VSS.
I was wondering about the relationship of those because you'll find the term somewhat interchangeable. Thank you for clarifying.
You find them interchangeable because on Windows they are.
Oh,
but since we're talking to, in this case, we're talking to an OmniOS file server,
yes,
we use ZFS snapshots to
cool.
achieve the same effect.
As does TrueNAS and does
Yes,
it right.
The reason I
shadow
asked,
copy service.
the reason I ask is I seem to recall doing something with VSS and tapes for backups and stuff like that, maybe 20 years ago or so.
Cool. Let's see. Chat is chatting. Volume. Oh, thank you for spelling that out. Oh, or there are multiple definitions for V, the acronym. So let me paste that in there. That's great. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Microsoft. With a handy link. Okay, other ideas, questions, comments. Greg, I've not forgotten about the whole notion of fancy improved auditing and all. I guess if someone wants to nudge the Alan Judes of the world to see how his review of the NFS auditing, etc. on previous V is progressing, I'm curious. Go ahead, you're clicking and scratching.
Oh, sorry,
yes,
I was
sir.
moving
No
my
worries.
mic in a position.
No worries.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm sure Alan's got lots of things on his plate. This is probably a pretty niche requirement, so.
Ooh, in some industries, it is kind of holy grail for the some. That's like Hollywood really wants some fine-grained auditing and know who to blame for for previews of movies disappearing.
Yeah,
anyway,
that's basically why we can't use it. We're starting a project with Sony, and they have some heavy auditing requirements. And
Hollywood's not alone in that, though. I mean, you look at any kind of banking
PHI,
stuff, and
PHI
medical stuff. All of them depend on this kind of thing. So,
what does Hollywood have to worry about? Users are only helping them archive their movies.
Market them. Helping them market them. That's it.
Disney would absolutely love if everyone had a copy of Song of the South.
Isn't that out of, it's not what? How many years until that's public domain?
It's getting there pretty quick,
isn't it?
Yeah, it's getting there pretty quick, I think.
But
I mean, just last year, we were getting Steamboat Willie into public domain here. So it's still a ways off because that one's actually in color. Steamboat Willie is not.
They managed to renew Mickey Mouse's too, didn't they? Or
no.
So he's public domain now?
Well,
they made their logo out of it. So
aspects are public domain. There's some trademark stuff you can run into, but I mean, they can try to sue you on Lanham Act, which is trademark, you'll likely win, but you're going to spend a boatload of money doing it.
Yeah, that's where they win.
All righty.
Yes.
And we won't talk about security at large government institutions. So, any other final points, questions, ideas? Alexander, you've been quiet. Craytonian, you've been quiet. Do you have anything to chuck in there? Ava, have you been searching things in parallel? Sure. Okay, well, we've covered some good ground. I'm fascinated by the notion that, say, Samba could have a little module for VFS channel programs that is nice and separate, and maybe even CDDL licensed if necessary, etc. I mean, they've got to think creatively.
Yeah, my friend wrote a module for Samba to do bin locking on Avid media files.
Oh, cool. There you go.
Yeah.
Neat.
Because to get the same functionality from Avid would cost you like $50,000 or something.
Did they share that?
Yeah. See if I can
got a
find
link.
it.
Oh, curious. Oh, see, it's
His
things
name
like
was
that.
Andrew. Yeah.
Oh, that must be our Andrew, right?
No, it is not.
Oh. Samba VFS plugin for.
This was like about 8 or 10 years ago, if you're looking for it.
Oh. Yeah, I'm sure there's only one Andrew on GitHub, but anyway, cool.
Andrew
Well,
Klassen.
I don't show up as Andrew on GitHub.
Yeah.
Let me do a search for that. That's kind of cool. And it just, yeah, be creative. This is generally Unix environments, or it's like 20 ways to do every single thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'll write that down and drop it in if I find it. So that raises the question: does anyone want the honor?
If you're entertained by our rantings, like and subscribe.
Cool. Thank you, everyone. I will fix this. I'll try to chase down that Avid plugin, and have a great week.
Yeah, you too, guys. Take care.